Anyway, while everyone is looking that up right now, Hugh, how about you regale us with a piece from Nowhere to
Okay.
Nowhere?
Okay. Well, I warned you that there's going to be some problems with voice here, and
Well, Gar-
unlike Jeff, I'm not going to attempt to
well,
assume a female voice.
Gary's story also has a female narrator, so it's not
That's
without
true,
precedent here.
but Gary's much more attractive than me, and
Obviously.
so I just I selected Gary being Mr. Imaginative, and also it's kind of confused. Some people told me it's a confusing story, and I thought if I start in the middle, it'll be even more confusing. So I'm just going to do the first couple of pages. The subtitle is Singing Frog. You ever watch those old Warner Brothers cartoons? Koch said, pulling the sheets up over himself. I wish he wasn't so modest. He looked pretty good for a relic from a different age. As an aside, that's a quote from a Paul McCartney and Wings lyric. But, anyway, yeah, they reran them for a few hundred years every Sunday afternoon. Koch nodded. That's good. What a strange question to ask in bed. Why? You're looking to start a Bugs Bunny fan club? Maybe Koch was a secret furry and he was trying to ease me into his world. Do you remember that one? Koch continued, keeping his gaze steadily on the ceiling, but also sliding his arm underneath and around me, sending me into a familiar feeling of uncertainty and bliss. Remember the one about the guy who found the singing frog? That only he could hear? It was my turn to nod. Yeah, it was very funny and extremely sad. That it was. Then nothing. We just lay there in bed, not saying anything. The silence was uncomfortable for me, each second of it more maddening. So what's your point? Koch turned and looked at me. He was smiling, but there was something a little sad in his eyes. Oh, just something came to mind. And what did that mean? I decided that if I wanted to have more sex tonight, I would probably leave that can of worms unopened for the time being. Another subtitle. Only way to describe the place. Huge iron coils, crazy complicated stacks of elaborately machined metal that might have been some sort of engines or maybe furnaces for heating asteroids, brains of long deactivated giant robots. Let me qualify my earlier observation. This was a very weird scrap heap. The 7 moons overhead produced a fair bit of light, so it seemed reasonably safe to walk forward without falling down some hole or the gaping maw of some until Rebecca monster. I heard a crunching sound as my boot pressed on what I thought was a thick layer of compacted rust. Now I had my doubts, but at least it was bearing my weight. More crunching as I walked deeper into the scrap heap. There were dozens of what I could only describe as really tiny vacuum tubes, except that they had rows of little wire legs with a spring antenna at one end and some were scurrying around, trying to avoid being flattened by my big plastic insole. They were alive? Machine organisms? I was pretty sure that when I told Koch about them, he'd just nod and shrug. Too bad Stanislaw Lem was dead and couldn't see these little cybernetic beasties. Now he would be impressed. I knew what both of those guys would tell me. Write it down if you think it's important. Time for that later. There were larger structures ahead, and they needed investigation. From my angle, it looked like the International Space Station was having group sex with an 18-wheeler tanker truck and a small fleet of mid-sized nuclear submarines. And that's all you get today. You have to buy the book for the rest of the story.
That's right, you do.
Worth it.
Very good.
Best machine sex description in the book, I think.
I beg your pardon?
Best machine sex description in the book.
Oh, well, thank you. It's It's so common these days, and
Well,
you want to try something different.
I think you were actually, Hugh, a big inspiration to Pop Seagull Press's anthology Robotica a few years ago.
I haven't read it.
Oh,
I'll
boy.
have to find it.
I can't remember. It may have been you or it may have been Ira Naiman, and kind of he and I and Liz Hurst were. I don't even remember how the conversation came about to there, but Robotica was born out of that conversation. I didn't go quite so edgy with The Light Between Stars, but you provided it for us, Hugh.
Well, you are a young company, and there's always new things to explore. I have to say that part of that, one of the earlier ventures into Canadian science fiction I was aware of in the 80s or the 90s was Candace Jane Dorsey's short stories collection called Machine Sex. And I definitely picked that one up because I wanted to find out what that was about, and I recommend if you can find a copy to read. It's very good stories. But yeah,
coming soon from Brain Lag. This will hit you, Catherine. Luba, come.
Why?
That is an inside joke that you will be able to find out this December from Cloning Freedom by Stephen B. Pearl.
All right. Well,
I was just going to call the anthology The Light Between and replace Stars, but maybe that's too obvious for the Machine Sex anthology. So
the light between your no.
Yeah, the next version.
My
may
God,
not,
it's full of stars.
I do a "My God, it's full of stars" joke in the con. So
Yes.
There was a brief in-joke in at least one friend group, which was basically finding as many excuses as you could to say two butt cheeks. We found some pretty good ones.
As opposed to one or more.
Well, we could have more in our genre. It's,
Machine sex, now featuring alien sex as well.
Well, it started because there's a really definitely 18 plus Pokemon fan game ROM hack thing called Pokemon My Ass version, and it started because I asked the question. I bought like a random box of a bunch of ROM hacks in physical copies, like a bunch of fan games in physical copies. And I said to everyone, I don't know what's in here. It's a blind bag. If I get 2 copies of Pokemon My Ass version, is that 2 butt cheeks?
Now, just to clarify one thing, for those who are thinking of getting the book, my story is not.
that was an unfortunate time to time out.
Yes.
Yeah.
No one can
It
hear you.
really was an unfortunate time to time out, yes.
It's a great story, though, folks. Read it.
Yes. Are you still with us, Hugh,
Thank you.
or have we lagged out here?
Are we done?
Simon's checking on things.
No, Hugh, you just froze for a
sorry.
minute.
Oh, am I back?
I'm a children's
Yes.
author. I don't get to
We've-
talk
we've
about 2
got
butt
you
cheeks.
now.
Oh, thank you. Just saying that my story doesn't have that much explicit sex. It's mostly a love story.
No,
we
it's
talk
a
about
very
feelings.
good story. Yeah, loved it.
Thank you. Well, you don't need to. Your story was great too. All of the stories are.
Yeah,
One
it's
of
a
the things
great
I love
anthology.
about this anthology is that it really the multiplicity of visions and expressions you get from Brain. Good sampler of has been able to do. It's really Catherine and her
And when
cat.
you buy it, you see, you'll get the rare collector's first edition that has the weird pagination error partway through.
Oh, I thought it
and
was It's just mine.
Yeah, it's just in that one story. The pages are in the right order. They just get assigned random numbers for a few pages.
Yes.
Quite appropriate, really.
It is, strangely.
I suppose so.
It's and I mean, I'm gonna guess that was the printer.
Unfortunately, I don't think it's possible to have been a printer error. I think that was my error, and I will be fixing it. It should be fixed for online orders probably within about a week or so. So the good news is all the page
So you
numbers...
hurry and get the collector's edition now.
There we go.
Yeah. Be worth $1 million.
Yes, the table of contents is still accurate. You just have to pretend that those randomly misnumbered pages are not there. Or
Just read through them. They're in the right order.
yes.
Right. It's not like it
Nothing's
could have been a
missing.
real disaster. Like,
Nothing's missing.
so it's what does anybody have any questions either out in here or out in
Or on
The Twitch universe. Yeah.
the Twitchiverse?
Chat. If
How
you
are
want
the
to-
lovely
Okay.
people in Twitch doing?
Yes.
I don't know if anyone who I know is listening, but y'all should ask questions.
That's right.
We are
You
here
know-
for your entertainment.
That
Even
is
ask us
correct.
personal
Are you not
questions.
entertained?
And why is it your fault?
If we don't get at least 5 questions, then we were going to not hold our fight to the death, and you'll see which brain lag author is the best fighter.
That's right.
It's not me.
Oh,
Let me get
darn.
my sword.
My swords are in the basement.
Oh, hang on, wait. I got 2 swords. I got 2 swords.
All of limited utility on the app. You know,
I mean, I could kick you through the internet, probably.
I got one behind that door too, but it's not really going to do much good.
I've just got a decoy here.
I could throw a Digimon V-Pad at one of you. Maybe with like enough precision, it'll hit you in the head and knock you out.
I have a pen.
It is mightier
you
than
know,
a sword.
Oh, what a nice
Hey,
reference.
the Hugos are being given out tonight, aren't they?
I'm waiting for my call.
Yeah, well,
I don't have anything.
you might be waiting a long
I
time.
have a
But,
feeling. I have a feeling.
well, no, actually, not this year, but maybe next year.
Oh, my dream is to win the Nobel Peace Prize for science fiction.
Excellent.
Now that one you will be waiting for.
Wow.
But Hugo, who knows? But aren't they going out tonight? I think
so.
Maybe.
I think this is the same weekend as virtual
Worldcon, yes.
Worldcon, except I don't think they're really doing a Worldcon. They're just kind of, I don't know.
I think they're doing something.
Yeah. Oh, there's something, and the Hugos are going out.
No, because I
Check
know
on
they're doing something.
We got a question from Anonymous Typewriter.
Yeah, so this question is directed to Erynn, but I think it's a good one to address everybody here, asking what made you want to write sci-fi fantasy? So, Erynn, since it was directed to you, how about you answer it first?
I'm going to be totally honest. I'm going to be completely honest. There's a whole lot of context for this involving Sonic the Hedgehog and really a lot of Japanese media. But the real answer is I just wanted magical stuff with the tone of anime, but set in a universe like Star Trek. And I've been constantly trying to capture the weird hybrid of Star Trek and shonen anime.
I like that.
Well,
Steven.
Picard did have an ersatz elf in the cast.
That is true.
For those of you who saw Picard.
Yeah.
Stephen, would you like to answer what made you want to write science fiction and fantasy?
I've always been fascinated with the idea of what if, and I'm fascinated by science, and I'm fascinated by mysticism. Consequently, what else could I do that would actually be of interest to me? If it's one step removed from reality, it grabs my consciousness and makes me want to explore it. And in literature, you can do that because you can distill down the facts and then place it into the actual consequences that would flow from that.
Good answer. Thank you. David, what made you want to write science fiction and fantasy?
Well, in a funny way, I'm not sure I do write science fiction and fantasy. I think that everything we write is fiction, and that we're pushing a story and narrative. And you were talking earlier about the unreliable narrator and how our perceptions of the world are not always, our perception is not always correct. So sometimes when we write about fantasy and about science, we're not writing about, oh, what if this could happen? These things could happen. So, dystopian worlds can happen. Mysticism can happen. If you're going to think of a supernatural fantasy, isn't the Bible, almost the supreme example of that? What greater fantasy could you write than write a story about a world where God intervenes and actually works? And while perhaps I haven't written on themes as deep and thoughtful as that, I think that most science fiction writers are the same. It's about finding your truth and about finding the tools to express that truth, rather than inventing things that are just sort of frivolous toys and saying, "Oh, look, what if we wrote a world about time travel?" You're doing it for a reason and for a purpose, and it's for a purpose that is nagging and dragging you into some sort of story that you have to write. I guess in a very long-winded way, I have said that what I generally write is the dreams that I have, the stories that I have, and everything else about it, science, mythology, fantasy, are just tools to tell that story.
I love that. Thank you. Simon, how about you? And I know you've written both ends of the spectrum, science fiction and fantasy, because Awakening, your story in the Light Between Stars, is very much science fiction, and it's not even necessarily very advanced science. It's very grounded in reality, and yet Soul, Light, and Wings was a wonderful sort of semi-urban fantasy. So what made you want to write science fiction and fantasy?
Oh wow, that's actually kind of a hard question. I mean, it's how do I put this? I'm not gonna say that.
Just say Tolkien.
Fantasy? No, not Tolkien. Actually, fantasy. There are a few reasons, but I think I'll say that fantasy isn't necessarily the fantasy science fiction. I could probably write it. I would probably be interested in writing a story in any genre, really. But for fantasy specifically, I think it's just kind of fun to not be bound by the rules of the real world. The idea so you can make the rules yourself. It's not just the characters you create, but also how they exist in their day-to-day life and such. While in real, if you set a story like a realist novel or like a crime novel or any other genre besides that in science fiction, you have to sort of follow what actually happens. Sort of, you got to follow the laws and the rules of real life, and I find that a bit restricting. So with fantasy, I don't know, I can get a bit crazy. That's about all I got.
Thank you. Gary.
Oh, Tolkien. No, I mean, when I was younger, I absolutely fell in love with mythology, and I think mythology was my gateway drug to both the fantasy genre, but also to history, which is my day job. But as I grew older, I really admired artists of all different types that could do multiple genres. Like in film, you have someone like Danny Boyle who can do any type of film, or different authors like Ian McDonald who can do all different types of story genres. And so I've tried to write, and I've so far published, not in huge literary magazines, so I'm not stroking my ego, but I've published short stories of all different genres, from like historical comedy to science fiction, fantasy, drama, all those sorts of things, because I think that it's a good thing to be able to really to not be stuck in any one thing. And so I think science fiction and fantasy can be great, but I really wouldn't consider the story that I put in to really be either of those. It's more like I think a drama with some fantastical elements. It's funny because as I forget, it was a couple conversations back, but I was trying to think over all the stories I read, which ones were the most realistic and which ones were the most completely unrealistic. I think that Nowhere to Nowhere might be the most unrealistic, which is not a bad thing. In fact, I think that's quite good. But I don't know. I think mine might be somewhere in the middle. So who knows?
Thank you. Hugh?
Oh boy.
Thank you, Hugh. And JD. What,
Yeah, I don't want to go too long because I think we have one more question. But the first things I published were literary fiction. I actually, in the 90s, I did a book of Northern Ontario regional fiction. So you can imagine how well that sold. But both reviews at the time were quite positive. Anyway. But I've always liked science fiction as well as other genres. And even in that book, there's a couple stories that edge into something that's not quite strict realism, depending on your point of view. And I've always thought it was interesting. The thing about fiction, any fiction, regardless of your genre, is you can respond to the world with stuff you've invented. And that might involve fantasy elements. It might involve science fiction. Science fiction was a huge part of my childhood because I'm old enough to have, watched the moon landing as a very little kid. And don't believe the people on YouTube, it happened. And this idea that we thought we were going to go into that kind of future, and that's not how things turned out. But that was sort of part of my childhood. And Star Trek reruns and things like that. So I've always been fascinated by that, as well as some of the more literary stuff. So I've always kind of played with genres, and I don't know that I'm doing anything significantly different, although the audience may be different. You're still finding a way to respond to the world in fiction, whether you make up some of the rules of the world, or you mythologize it, or you imagine how technology might change it and how we can comment on the real world with that, or whether you're sticking to what could strictly happen. Point in fact, in my novel that's coming out from Brainlag, there's a lot of ways to read it. And if the alien character is real, then that novel is science fiction. And if the alien character is a figment of the main character's imagination, because they're both figments of mine, then that book is realistic fiction. told from a really deranged perspective. And I don't have the answer to that. It's like Kelvin and Hobbes, if you remember Kelvin and Hobbes, the comic strip. The answer is up to the reader. It's always in the end up to the reader, not because the story can mean anything you want it to. If that's the case, you could just read the phone book. You get an old phone book back when we had them. But because it can mean quite a few different things. And it's up to them to decide, what's this story's concept of reality? What is it saying about reality? Or am I just enjoying it as a depiction of something? Because that's a lot of fun too. I mean, there doesn't have to be a meaning to a talking fairy cat. There can just be a talking fairy cat because that's cool, right? And you can use dystopia or a spaceship culture to comment on very human things, or you can use them because they're an interesting concept for going somewhere, and that could be cool too. So I don't know if that's the answer, but I do think we have one more question from Islanders Caper, so maybe that's what we want to look at.
Yeah.
I love science fiction, but there's all kinds of genres, and they all bleed together in the end.
That's true. Thank you for all your answers, everybody.